Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers, for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
Episode 12, a deeper look into balanced dog training. Hey guys, welcome back to the Dog Trainers Podcast. This is episode 12, a deeper look, balanced dog training. Now, we got such a wonderful response from our last episode, a deeper look, pure positive training, that we decided to keep this going for a bit. We're going to dissect yet another training method. My name is Mariano. That's Brent. You can find us on Instagram. My Instagram is Untamed Dog Co. That's all one word, Untamed Dog Co. You can find Brent at Canis Behavior, Canis Behavior. Again, all one word. So we're excited to dissect this thing, and I'm going to kick it over to you, Brent.
Thank you so much, Mariano. How you been, man? It's been a
Pretty
whole
good.
week since I've heard from you.
I know, man. It's been a busy one, I think, for you too.
It's been busy. Hey, but they are loosening up some of these quarantine stay-at-home things.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty excited about it. I can't wait for that day I can go and eat real food other than stuff that I'm making at the house.
What's wrong with stuff at the house?
Well, yeah. Well, it's
Actually, I get you. I'm
you
just
get what
putting
I'm saying. Like,
Yeah.
I just want to go. I just want to go eat food that someone else has made
I
for
hear
me.
you. Episode 12, a deeper look
Something not
into
from a
balanced
box.
dog
Also,
training.
that would be ideal. But anyways, welcome back, everybody. As Mariano said, this is our balanced dog training episode where we're going to break down some of the good practices, bad practices of balanced dog training. But we're also going to go ahead and talk about what balanced dog training is. That's super important. So I guess let's dive into what it is. Balanced dog training, in essence, if we're going to put it together in several sentences, or I'm going to try my best to put it in one sentence, balanced dog training is a multidisciplined approach in training where we are able to customize and design specific program protocols for the type of dog that we're training. Now I know this might be able to be applied to a bunch of different types of dog training. However, the difference between balanced dog training is that we pull from a bunch of different training philosophies, techniques, ideas, theories, practices in order to be able to get our clients, both the human and the dog clients, to be able to get understand each other on a more balanced level. Right. Obviously, when we say the word balanced, we are leaning towards the middle, right? That's one way to look at this. However, it's a sliding scale in the middle is kind of how I look at it, because there are some dogs who need a little bit more of this. There are some dogs who need a little bit more of that. And our job as balanced dog trainers is to be able to assess, and not only assess, but to be able to have the knowledge and experience in a multidisciplined approach to be able to help as many dogs as possible with those different knowledge bases.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out for people, because I completely agree with that statement, that it's a job of a good balanced trainer to seek the middle. Mm-hmm. The middle isn't always exactly the middle, but the concept is there. You know, if a dog needs a little bit more of this type of method versus this type of method, it doesn't necessarily mean that the dog would do its best under only one form. You know, for an example, let's say the two big camps are always like pure positive versus, you know, what's like the absolute maximum. I think in most people's heads, let's just say like e-collar work is like the epitome of corrective training as people see it. They think of e-collars as like, if your dog is really, really bad, right? Mm-hmm. And we know that's not the case, but
no. Just
as an example, it's rarely like 50% of each of these. The truth is somewhere in between. So it'll be like 80% food work with 20% e-collar, or, you know, vice versa, depending on the dog and the situation. So I completely agree with that statement. You know, so for young trainers listening to us, just keep in mind, the middle isn't always at 50, but wherever it does exist, you find that and you work from there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think seeking the balance is something that we'll talk about a little bit later, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So I personally consider myself a balanced dog trainer. Mariano, how about you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. So let's go ahead and dive in a little bit into our stories, how we became balanced dog trainers. I'll go ahead and get started. So when I learned how to be a dog trainer in the very beginning, it wasn't all necessarily, it definitely was a very unevolved version of what I do now. right? However, what I was introduced to, this is something we can talk about later in a different podcast. I was introduced to a very traditional form of training, which is called the Keeler method of dog training. And Keeler method is one of the more traditional military forms of dog training. A lot of leash involved, a lot of correction involved, a lot of collars involved. And this form of dog training, again, in context, was designed for dogs who were aggressive, who were about to get put down, or who were about to get euthanized. So the pool of dogs that this training method was created from was the very driven, stubborn, dominant, reactive, aggressive type dogs, right? So as a byproduct of that, a lot of the methods were pretty heavy-handed. Definitely it did kind of sway a little bit more to this idea that dogs in essence were trying to control you. So I definitely know what it's like to have a dominance dog mentality, right? Where dogs are dominant creatures, and if you don't control them first, they're going to learn to control you, yada, yada, yada. All the things we've talked about in other podcasts that don't sit right with anyone nowadays.
Right.
But just like anything, you learn, and eventually what happens is you learn the limits of that method or technique or philosophy that you run, which eventually forces you to learn something different or something new. Now, as it usually goes in my story, I went from one extreme to a very different extreme, where I went from correction-based and pressure-based training to where now I wanted to work with motivation. I wanted to work with food. I wanted to work with all these different things. And what happened to me specifically over 10 years was there were many dogs that I would run into that I'd be able to help. And then there would be a handful of dogs that I wouldn't be able to help, that I wasn't able to be effective with, that in essence, I felt I let the dogs down. Mm-hmm. I let their owners down. And it got to this point where my passion for wanting to help more animals forced me to continue to learn things. So I would read books. I would watch seminars, I'd go to seminars. I'd watch videos. I would download and pay for any subscription thing that I could pay for and watch at the time so I could learn something new. And I remember a very powerful video. It was Michael Ellis's The Power of Training Dogs with Food. And I remember seeing this complete different look at dog training, and what it did, it opened my eyes up to a spectrum of dog training. I didn't really know what it was or what it was going to be called later in the future, but I started to see all these different toolboxes to choose from, right? Like I had my driver set, I had my wrench set, I had my, all these different tools that now where I just thought before I had a hammer and some nails, so I had a big diverse group of tools. And gradually through the years, what we started diving into is I started diving into a little bit more of like competitive food work. I started diving into some protection work and things like that. I started diving into behavioral modification and reading a lot of studies and getting to work with a couple of veterinary behaviorists nearby to just understand their philosophies and their ideas and being able to put their things to practice, or their philosophies to practice. And so you start to the more knowledge I gained, the more that the matrix in my brain started connecting all the dots. And I had this matrix of knowledge in my brain that eventually would later become my version of balanced dog training, right? And so that's how I started. How did you start?
I started in the Air Force. So I actually started in a very similar light. A lot of Keeler method, a lot of leash work, a lot of high pressure, like working dog stuff that we were training dogs on Lackland Air Force Base and just sending them wherever they needed to be. And after that, you and I met, and then it was Bobby and you and Corey and, just kind of learning things and figuring out the ins and outs of more leash work that was kind of more tailored to a client's perspective as opposed to a dog with a very specific job to do, but more of a well-rounded pet that needed to know when to turn it on, but also when to turn it off, how to socialize well with other dogs. And when we look at the balanced dog training spectrum, I was definitely in that same camp of being maybe a little more heavy-handed and a little more. There wasn't enough nuance to my dog training game, at least from a client's perspective. I mean, maybe for military dogs, that's the way to go, but in that case, now we're talking something completely different with like purpose-bred built dogs that it's not quite the same thing. So later in my training career, me and Brent have made this joke before. I forget, maybe on one of our other videos and thing, you and I have similar yet very different training backgrounds because you were lucky enough to hang out with Bobby for like a really long time. Bobby Durafshar, a great behaviorist, probably one of the great behaviorists of our time. Whereas I was kind of the different, going like to different kennels and learning different methods. And we got back together like years later. We were always, in context, we're friends, but like as trainers, we found ourselves working together again a few years later. And we realized that there was just so much valuable insight that each of us had learned in our respective paths to that point. And where that brought me ultimately with training was I, just like you, really started to understand the value of food work and of motivational work. And corrections definitely have their place, but I would say that I just got more potent with them. So I can do them less. I can do them softer, lower, however you want to look at
less
it.
Frequent, yeah.
Less frequent, right. And still get a really good result out of it. And in so doing, I also got better at my overall understanding of dog training as a whole. It's not just about corrections. It's not just about motivation. It's about routine, socialization, behavioral development, and all these different things. And that's allowed me to kind of perfect my game. So to this date, I think that these days I'm kind of at my optimum in terms of my understanding of dog training. And of course, this is going to evolve over time. We're always learning.
Yeah.
But at this moment, I'm pretty happy with the package that we're able to present here today, and see what we can get out of balanced training as an idea here.
Yeah, I love it. I love that. And I guess, how do you feel about balanced dog training versus pure positive training?
So this one's a topic that I was really excited to bring up within balanced training. Was how do you feel about this versus this? Because you and I have talked about this forever, how people in the dog training world, and some people who aren't even like trainers, I've seen some guys on YouTube who aren't necessarily dog trainers, but they're kind of like dog training commentators, that's just their little like niche. And they either stick to this side or that side, and they kind of go and slander this or that as you're too foolish and you're too idealistic, or you're too harsh and like barbaric. And the way that I feel about balanced dog training versus positive reinforcement is I want to be 100% clear. Balanced dog training includes positive reinforcement training. And I do not think that positive reinforcement training is in any way wrong or foolish. It's such a huge part of my program, and yours too, with basically every dog. And it's just the difference as I see it. It's our job to be good positive reinforcement trainers, but it's also our job to have really researched and mastered the other methods around positive reinforcement training that would help us round out a dog. Because I think that a real balanced trainer, their job is to train a dog and an owner and create a situation, as we just talked about. It's more than obedience, it's routine and socialization and stuff like that. Creating a situation that is as practical and pragmatic and safe as it possibly can be. So can you take a dog, and maybe like if time and money and stuff like that wasn't a factor, can you take a hyper aggressive dog and completely train that out of them with food? Maybe, I don't know. I personally don't think so, but I suppose it's possible.
Right.
Does that mean that that's the most realistic, course of action that someone should consider? I don't necessarily think so. If an e-collar can get you there faster and safer and have a certain element to it of like being fail proof, like, if the food doesn't get the dog's attention, the collar will type thing, then I think it's our responsibility as trainers to recommend to owners to absolutely maximize this dog's potential for long-term viability and safety and happiness.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I mean, just kind of like we talked about in the pure positive video, there's a lot of bad practices, pure positive, but there's also some great things. And I think one thing of balanced dog training is it definitely does pull some of the best techniques that it possibly can, some of the most efficient, some of the most proactive, some of the most engaging all these great qualities that you could want in dog training. It pulls those techniques from other disciplines, right? So let's kind of go into a little bit of what operant or what balanced dog training in essence is. Okay. If you were going to ask an operant or a balanced dog trainer what it is, in essence, the difference is between pure positive and balanced dog training is we actually use all 4 quadrants of the operant conditioning scale. Right. So versus pure positive just uses positive reinforcement. They'll also use negative punishment. So they will remove things, as the dog to punish the dog. However, we use those as well as also using positive punishment, which is the adding of an aversive to change motivation or a decision. And then we also use negative reinforcement, which is the application of pressure. In order with the intention of removing that pressure once the learner does what we want, right? So I think it's best to really teach people what the full operant conditioning scale looks like in practicality. So let's kind of go over it real quick. So positive reinforcement, as we all know, is teaching a dog to do something with the use of rewards, right? So I give the dog a reward to positively reinforce a behavior, and the likelihood of that behavior happening again in the future is higher. Now, that reward could be praise, love, toy, could be food, could be freedom, could be all these different things. However, positive reinforcement is usually something the dog likes, something that is desirable, and leveraging that to teach new behaviors. Okay. Negative reinforcement. I think this is really important to talk about right after. Negative reinforcement is what we know as escape and aversion, or pressure work, right? Which we'll hear it talked about in dog training a lot. The best way that we can kind of exemplify pressure or escape and aversion, or escape and avoidance is very simple, right? Like, how do kids learn to be responsible when they're younger, right? Most humans' behavior is based off of the avoidance of something negative, right? So like we go to work, most of America doesn't necessarily go to work because they like their jobs. I'm lucky to like my job, but most people go to work so that they don't go poor, so that they don't suffer a negative consequence, right? Or so that they can eat, or so that they can contribute to their family in some shape or form. So negative reinforcement is really capitalizing on pressure. So common one that we see with kids is going to be like, how do we teach kids to clean their room? Usually the parental figures will apply pressure. Pressure could come in the form of being nagging, of potential consequence, of getting confrontational. It could come in so many different forms. But pretty much the way that a kid learns to clean their rooms, or the way that they learn to turn off their parents' nagging or complaining or attitude, is by actually yielding and doing what it is that their parents or the teacher wants them to do, right? So in essence, negative reinforcement is the concept of teaching something to yield and give in, right? And if we can teach something to yield and give in, well, this now allows us to shape new behaviors that maybe that character or personality wasn't inclined to do naturally. Right. So this helps us a lot in behavior modification as well. Right. Positive punishment is the simple adding of something aversive, or a consequence. We're adding a consequence to a bad decision so that bad decision does not happen again in the future. This is, in dog training, is known as the basic correction, right? There's a variety of different things it could be. And then we have negative punishment, which is the removal of something desirable from the dog. We call this the penalty rule. So very similar to how when we get caught speeding on the interstate, they don't take our car away necessarily. However, they take our money away in the form of a ticket. So this is called negative reinforcement. They're taking something away that is desirable from us to teach us a lesson or to punish behavior.
If you go fast enough, they'll take your car away.
Yeah, if you go fast enough, many times in a row, they will take your shit away. Right? So this is the full operant conditioning scale in its entirety. We have rewards. We have escape and avoidance, or yielding. we have the corrections or punishments, and then we also have the penalties, right? And we use all of four quadrants of this in a very diverse and dynamic way to be able to shape and teach behaviors, and also to be able to create systems that are easily mimicked by dog owners as well. That's very important.
100%. Yeah, I think that what this ultimately ties into, when we think of the 4 quadrants of conditioning, I believe, and you tell me if you agree with this, every single dog training method falls somewhere within those 4 quadrants. That's basically an all-inclusive approach. Now, when we talk about a multidisciplined approach in dog training, and I know that we wanted to bring this up for sure, was how positive reinforcement training in the public eye has kind of taken on a different meaning, and it's kind of become like idealized, and the word balanced has gotten a little wonky over the years too.
Yeah.
And I know that we wanted to clear the air there before we continue with the word balance. So when we consider multidisciplined approach to training, the word balance, like we talked about before, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're perfectly 50% here, 50% there, or 25 with 4 different methods of training. What we're referring to is you have a dog and its core issues, or a dog, let's say, doesn't have any issues like a puppy. I mean, it'll still have certain things like lack of focus and whatever else, minor issues. But then you have there's several factors in dog training that our young dog trainer friends need to keep in mind whenever you're assessing a dog and assessing a client with an evaluation for potential training clients, or writing up your programs overall if you're doing it just for your website or whatever the case. It's not just about the dog. Where the dog is right now, issues and things like that, all the core, pedigree information falls into that. What's the breed? What's the age? What's going on here? That's one thing. The other aspect to that can be the owner, because you can have 2 identical dogs with 2 very different owners looking for 2 very different things. That plays a huge role in the type of training you're going to do, because again, it's your job to do the best job for them in their particular household. And that changes depending on what that household looks like. That is the information that you need to start piecing together in order to kind of dial in a training program that is most efficient. And when we find that balance, it may not be 50-50. It may be 20% this, 30% this, and whatever the remaining percentage of this, 50, right? So I wanted to kind of bring that up, and I wanted to hear your thoughts a little bit on the word balance, because it has gotten a little weird, and I'm glad you brought that up, and just before we started this whole thing, and I definitely want to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so it's funny because I'm a Libra, right? So balance is our thing. So maybe yeah, you're a Libra too, right?
Yeah.
Balance is our thing. I don't want to get into that stuff, but kind of how like horoscopes get kind of hokey and they get a little too spiritual, or they get a little bit. They're not scientific, right? The word balance over the years have kind of become this had the same interpretation, right? We always think balanced as in Zen, or balanced as in spiritual, or whatever it might be, right? Now there are some people in the industry that have kind of taken the word balanced and they've turned it into something spiritual or hokey. However, as balanced dog trainers, balance is about balancing the scale, right? Like if I were to take a dog's behaviors and good and bad behaviors and put it on a scale, and I saw that it was out of whack, how could we balance that out, right? How could we, in essence, neutralize bad behaviors and increase positive behaviors? Like, how can we do that? In order for that to happen, if we are trying to control the negative and the good behaviors, and at the same time, then that means we need to have an understanding and a competency in both how to motivate and how to, eliminate bad behaviors, right? Motivate and eliminate behavior, right? So that's the gist of that. But ultimately, the original term balanced is really just supposed to mean we don't pick a side necessarily, right? We're like that independent, right? We're not Democrat, we're not Republic, we're that independent. We both love dogs, but we're not necessarily going to pick a team per se, because we see the value of both teams. We also respect both teams, and to pick one team over the other would not be the wisest for the dog in our opinions, right?
Yeah. And the owner, in the household.
And the owner or the household. Yeah. To limit our knowledge base and picking teams, in essence, balanced dog trainers are constantly seeking balance for their dogs.
Would you agree if I said, people listening, consider balanced dog training to mean neutral dog training? Okay. We're not here, we're not there. It's whatever the dog needs. It depends. I don't know. It depends on the situation. Right.
I think neutral doesn't, in my personal opinion, doesn't give me the best amount. Well, I get what you're saying. We're just not picking sides. Yeah. Neutral is definitely a better word than maybe the perceived, connotation of balanced, but, yeah, we're not picking sides. I think that's the most important thing.
It's okay. I mean, I'm just throwing it out there. I'm not suggesting that we start coining training from here on out as neutral. For people listening, I like the term balanced dog. It just has that ring to it that it's kind of developed over time.
I think one thing I kind of want to just put out in the ether and see what happens. Let's go ahead and I'd like to refer to balanced dog training as a spectrum of training. Right. So I have always looked at dog training as there's as many methods and philosophies and approaches to dog training as there are colors in the rainbow. Right. So ultimately is every practice and application of a technique or method can be done differently in many different degrees and in many different shades, if you will. And it's going to change based on the dog, the owner, the personality, the trainer, etc. Right. So in essence, in my mind, it's always looked like a color wheel or like a spectrum: blue, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. And balanced dog trainers learn how to navigate that spectrum of dog training.
Right. And let me shameless plug you one more time. So I believe it was exactly 10 episodes ago. It was episode 2 or episode 3 that we talked about finding a way in which we could simplify and dial down a way for an owner to seek out information that would bring them to a program that would be sort of bespoke to their personal needs. Mm-hmm. Their dog taken into consideration, their situation taken into consideration, and all things considered, finances, location, maybe there isn't a certain train, so I know that you and I have talked in the past about, and we're still working on this, guys, creating a program, a way to streamline all the endless information out there in order to find something that will realistically work for you in particular, not like a cookie cutter approach to dog training like we see too often.
Yeah.
Now, with that being said, I just wanted to add, and this kind of segues a little into our next point of, a good balanced dog trainer. I completely agree that training overall exists on a spectrum. There's this, there's this, there's this. The only thing I wanted to add to it was keep in mind, everyone, each individual training methodology. Let's say you're not a balanced dog trainer. Let's say you only believe in one method and you're just listening to this just to hear what's out there, which is great. Mm-hmm. If we have any pure positive guys out there listening right now, even pure positive training in and of itself exists on a spectrum. I was working with a client today. I had 2 lessons today, and I worked with one client today in particular that we were doing strictly food work because it was our first lesson together, and I wanted to shape behaviors. And their dog was so rambunctious that I had to be really quite precise with my, and I had to be like myself, almost a little more stoic in my motion to not overexcite the dog, and they're jumping and then I'm losing their focus. But as the lesson went on, it's hot out here, by the way. I'm in Arizona. It was 150 today. So,
Lord.
So the dog conked out pretty quick. And as he did, I had to turn up my energy a lot in order to keep the dog motivated. So even within one particular realm of training, there is that spectrum that you have to learn how to play with. And a balanced dog trainer knows how to do that within each particular method, and then knows how to do it with a few other methods at the same time. So it can be your food work looks like this within the food work, spectrum, but your other work looks like this within that particular spectrum.
Yeah. Yeah. No, makes sense. And I think it's kind of learning the interpersonal workings of each method.
Right. Exactly.
How to communicate that method effectively to the dog.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So let's get into, I think our next subject we want to talk about is, we talked about what people think it is, right? Or how it can kind of be misinterpreted.
Mhm.
But let's go ahead and go into, just as we did at the other episode, let's talk about what good practices in balanced dog training looks like, right? Because this is going to be really hard, or it's hard for everyone to say that they've done this before. Okay,
Right.
so let's go ahead. What do you got?
Okay. Well, here, I'm going to go over a couple points, but I'm going to let you start because our first point in particular is one that Bobby, Bobby Giraffe, who I know Bobby, but you've known Bobby for ever. And, and just knowing you guys as I have, like, together, Bobby has always had, like, he's always really kind of looked out for you and really made it a point to be there for you, which I think is great. So I'm going to let you speak on Bobby.
Sure.
But the one that I think that applies to this is Bobby definitely had a way of formulating his training approach in such that he would teach us, read the dog and let the dog tell you kind of what they're looking for from you. It's all about being present with the dog, tune all the other stuff out. You create the energy in any training session that you want to be there. And it was definitely, like, in a good way. It was a very heavy thing to have to pick up and run with, because it was like, when you have great training lessons, it's like, well, good for you. But when you're out of whack, it was hard. It was good, and I'm glad, but it was hard when, like, I'm having a bad day for whatever reason, and and you call me out, because we're friends. You just tell me like it is, and it's like, dude, you're like sucking right now. What's going on?
You're sucking. Yeah.
But it's good though. I appreciate the honesty, and I think that it's ultimately very beneficial for us as trainers, because we have an obligation to this dog and this client.
Exactly.
So, so as much as I don't want to get into the whole hokiness, and then I'll let you take over. About balance and Zen and stuff like that, and I'm not making fun of anybody's, like, ideals, but to the extent that I do agree with you, there does need to be balance even within the trainer. If you're, like, upset or whatever the case, knock that out.
Great point. Great freaking point. That's so important. I think on two scales here. One part of being a really good balanced dog trainer is you have to constantly seek out balance for each and every dog that you work on. Right. Now, sometimes, we might notice patterns in dog training. So we might have, like, certain ways that you start, or certain things you like to focus on because they interest you. However, there gets to this point where, in order to make the most amount of progress, and in order to really start seeing, like, lifelong changes in dogs, we have to really understand dogs at a very deeper level. And one thing that my mentor, Bobby, taught me, amongst many things, was really making sure that you figured out what the best way to bring balance to all the variables are. Right. And so sometimes the balance of the variables is the home environment, or the types of owners that we're dealing with, right? Are they consistent? Are they inconsistent? Are they going to do the work? Are they not going to do the work?
Are they overly emotional?
Are they overly emotional? Are they heavy-handed? Are they mean?
Right.
So there's so many different things. And part of whatever training method that we were going to imply at the time, it had to bring balance, as much of balance as possibly possible, to that circumstance, right? Because ultimately what our goal was, and one thing he used to always say, and he still says it till this day, he goes, my client is the dog. The human just takes care of my client, And so he would say that all the time. And it's the truth. If you put yourself in the mind space and the head space of, like, how do I make this dog live the optimum life, then it definitely becomes a whole different mission than just being a better trainer than the guy next to you, right? Or making that sale, or, getting that client, making that client happy. It becomes about making your four-legged client happy, right? So I think that's one great thing about any balanced dog trainer. And there is no finish line to that journey, if you will. It is constantly, as long as you are seeking to get better every single time you work with the dog, to become more balanced, to find harmony in that circumstance with that dog owner, that environment, their behavior problems, et cetera, then you are on the right path, at least becoming a balanced dog trainer.
Right.
In essence, balanced dog trainers don't really like to say they quit. right? There's always something else to learn or something else to do, or something else that they can try with a dog, because at the end of the day, it's for the dogs.
Well,
Okay.
all of dog training is about evolution. So when we consider perfection in its like, not in its weird abstract, but in its practical, like my client's dog's issues are this, we need to get them here. Let's say you get them there. Now, even that finish line is a moving target because, again, life goes on. So what if the client is a young couple who hikes all the time, blah, 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 5, 10 years later, now there's children. Now we're talking something different. So now the finish line has been moved a little bit. So it's always a matter of just dialing in and keeping everybody where they need to be. And also dogs evolve over time too. A 6-month-old puppy won't be the same, like behaviorally speaking, as a 3-year-old dog for many reasons. So it's always this fun, it's always this ever-changing thing. And it's really nice as dog trainers that, I love meeting new clients all the time, but I really love also getting to see, previous clients who are back like a year later. I see how the dogs grow. I just saw, Thor and Waffle just had an Instagram made. It's a couple dogs that we worked with. Yeah. Waffle's so huge now. And like,
I'm sure there's a puppy.
Yeah. And he's it's great to see them, and it's great to hear that they're doing well, and how they've changed so much, and how the owners have evolved with the information that we've given them, and they've kind of made it their own. And I think that that's awesome.
Yeah. That's awesome. That is great. Okay. Sounds good. So let's get into another thing that we think would be a good practice for balanced dog training. One thing is to master or be proficient with as many techniques or methods of dog training as possible, right? Because I know one thing that I've learned in my own career is that if I didn't obsess over certain techniques, whatever they were, could be, advanced food work or clicker training or marker training in general, Keeler method, off leash work, e-collar work. If I didn't obsess over learning those methods, I wouldn't have learned the limits of each of those methods, because each method has a limit, just like every martial arts has a limit, right? It's really important to test out those methods, test out those theories, test out the way you wield those methods and those theories, to really get a better understanding of how effective you can be within any given method. That's super important, right? Also making sure that you surround yourself with mentors who can teach you what those the extent of those methods as well, right? Because, learning something via a book or a video is one thing, but definitely having a mentor who can teach you and show you is super important as well, so that you can even expand those limits to even a further place, right? And then another aspect that I think is invaluable to a lot of dog trainers. It is strange how this exists, but there are dog trainers who don't understand actual dog behavior, and they don't necessarily know how to read a dog's body language effectively, right? And this makes sense, because some of the times the only way one can actually learn dog body language or behavior is by spending time with lots of groups of dogs, right? On an individual basis and on a group basis. And not every dog trainer has that ability to be able to, see big groups of dogs and how they interact with each other and read body language on a daily basis, right? What are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree. I think that I've learned so much that's helped me be a better trainer. And training is typically no more than like 2-3 dogs in a home at a time. But I've learned so much that has helped me dramatically improve my training game from daycare stuff. And seeing how dogs behave when there's like 20, 30, 50 of them at a time, and how a group can influence, another group, like let's say 6 dogs doing whatever and 6 other dogs see this, versus like, there's a certain like amplification to having like multiples of dogs. Like one dog is, has this going on. When there's 2 dogs in the house, it's not twice that, it's like 6 times that, because they rile each other up. And now there's all these different variables that have been created because there are several dogs. So I agree.
Right. Yeah. So understanding body language, dog body language, and behavior is super important. I remember some assignments would be, at my old company, if we didn't have enough dogs in daycare, we would literally, one of our assignments would be to go to the dog park and study and watch dogs interact with each other and try and come up with interpretations of what conversations they were having with one another, with the humans. And it's crazy. Like, Like, I mean, think of, this is kind of off topic, but like how many dogs have you seen poop in your career?
I don't even know. I don't want to know that number. Why am I thinking of this?
Like it's uncountable.
Right.
But think of how good you are at being able to predict when a dog has to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like something so subtle
and
so nuanced that you pick up on it, and you're able to see language fluently. Body language. Go ahead.
Let me give context to what you've just said too, because I had this earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I was walking a dog. This was our second e-collar lesson, and I believe our fourth lesson overall. So we started with food work, moved to leaf pressure at the e-collar. Mm-hmm. Now, this dog has a history of being reactive on the leash, being not reactive inside the house, but being just too much in the house, jumping and so after having done our first e-collar lesson last Saturday, they did really good work this week. And today the dog looked great and we were healing, and I couldn't be more happy and I couldn't be more impressed. I was proud of them. I was telling them how proud I was of them. And right toward the end of the walk, dog started pulling, and the client was being tuned in. I was walking the dog. Client was being tuned into me, really paying attention to when I was correcting what I was doing with my leash, with my collar, with my verbal no and goods and markers. So when the dog started pulling toward the grass, they were like, are you doing this? Are you doing that? And I said, no. And I released him, break. And I told them, just according to how things are going and how well this dog is doing and how obstinate he's being just all of a sudden, I think he has to poop. I don't think he's being stubborn. I think he has to go. Yeah. And so he goes into the grass, boom, poops like a little while later. And there we go. And then throw him back and heel, and the dog was great again. And I was like, yeah, so it is good to know these things.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, poop. I mean, we all know the feeling of a good poop, but it's just the little nuances of understanding dogs' comfortability and desires and motivation, excitement, all those things, fear, all those things are really, really important. And that honestly helps us in the knowing of what method, idea, technique that needs to be executed at that time. Right. Okay, cool. So I think we did a good job. So far we talked about the good practices of balanced dog training. What are some bad practices that you could think of in balanced dog training?
I think the biggest thing that I see wrong, and by biggest, I mean not only the thing that has the potential to go the most sideways, but also the most popular thing that I see done wrong, is people who are of a balanced training mindset. They're not balanced enough. They're not, we're going to touch on this in more detail in a bit, but every balanced dog trainer comes to the table from somewhere. They've got a pure positive background, a Keeler method background, or whatever the case background. And until you're confident in the later methods that you pick up along the way, naturally you lean on what you know. True. So you're like a balanced trainer, but you're a little quicker to go to prong collar. You're a little quicker to do this or that. And I think that balanced trainers aren't always balanced enough at the time.
Right. And that's where it's really important to make sure you have a mentor around to help you troubleshoot, because, you're always going to default to your highest level of conditioning, whatever that is. Right. And that's important. And I think that's like, to be honest, to strive for balance is a lifelong process, right? And it's a case-to-case basis. The more dogs you train, the better you get. But at the same time, sometimes there are decisions that need to be made right then and there, right? There are decisions that, the scale isn't actually living in the middle. Sometimes you have to make decisions by going hard left or hard right, right? And sometimes that's how you achieve the big picture of balance. And this is something that was said to me a while back. I don't know it specifically per word, but they said balance isn't putting things in the middle all the time or compromising all the time. Balance is created through making complete decisions on either side until you've achieved balance and compromise that way. So it's not compromising on the decision, like saying like, yeah, we both kind of win. No, it's sometimes I win, sometimes you win. Sometimes you win, sometimes I win. And through that, we create balance and unity, right? So it's an interesting concept. But yeah, I totally get that. Some dog trainers are not balanced enough. And it's just a struggle. You have to keep trying. And I think it's really important to have a mentor with you who can help you rationalize why you should or shouldn't do a certain method, technique, or idea with that dog.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay. I think one that I want to talk about that's really important is not knowing a training method well enough, right? I think in order to really, it's important for you to really test your limits in a dog training philosophy, right? Because what you'll start seeing is you will start seeing where the other dog training philosophy may fill in those gaps. And a lot of times people might dabble in training, but just kind of like, think of it like a person who like got up, went on YouTube and just tried to learn as much as they could and then started training dogs. That person wouldn't be well versed in any specific method of dog training because the way that the content is spilled out lately, it's all over the place, right? So it's really important for whatever you decide to do, whether it's marker work, do marker work for several months with many, 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 many dogs so that you can understand the limits of marker training. If you're going to work with pure positive, do pure positive for many, many months with many, many, many dogs so that you can see what the limits and are on that. And when I say limits, I don't mean the failures. I mean the successes and the failures. What can you achieve with that method? If you're going to be working with e-collar, what are the limits? What are the rules behind e-collar? And what are the good and the bad things that can happen with e-collar work, right? So you have to commit to my feeling is you have to commit to a discipline long enough to be able to understand those limits within that discipline.
Yeah, 100%. And let me add this one more time about the spectrum within training, because when you're deep diving into one particular training method, your particular efficiency or mastery of that method will dramatically factor into your like success rate, your hit rate, so a kind of rudimentary e-collar trainer can deep dive into e-collar training and kind of come to the conclusion that like, okay, well, e-collar has its values and it also has its downsides, as everything in the world does. And they'll kind of conclude that balance is a little like, there's a lot of downsides, let's say. Whereas a better e-collar trainer would be like, oh yeah, well, a lot of those downsides can actually be mitigated if you do XYZ. It still falls within the realm of e-collar work. So definitely deep dive into the various methods of dog training that will best serve us all, the dogs, the client, and everything, but really take the time to master it. And Brent said it, I'm just making sure to hammer it home. Get very good at it. Don't kind of learn the rough ins and outs of it and then just roll with that for a few months. Get as particular as you can.
Yeah, and work with many, many dogs.
Right.
That's the only way that you can figure out any particular method in training. Last thing I want to talk about is and this can happen across the board. Don't get me wrong. But this is specifically with balanced dog trainers who pride themselves on, trying to cater and customize things based on the dogs. If you have a very shallow approach to an issue, right? Or if you have a very not in-depth approach to dog behavior issues, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you may underplay or generalize things too much, right? Like we might say aggression, aggression, the dog's being dominant. So X, Y, I'm going to handle it with, Keeler method corrections, right? Mm-hmm. But, don't get me wrong. I'm saying this because I've been there before. Aggression needs to be controlled. Well, one thing I've also learned, other than operant conditioning, classical conditioning should be a huge part of a balanced trainer's repertoire as well, mm-hmm. right? Classical conditioning is the emotional association to something that at one point had a neutral meaning to the dog, right? So concepts like a place command, concepts like desensitization, constant like patience protocols or relaxation protocols, like these types of things are super important to teach dogs that involve a lot of classical conditioning. And sometimes, I remember when I was a younger dog trainer, it was so easy to just say, this behavior is dominance, or this behavior is pure adolescence attitude, or this behavior is this or that. And sometimes it's not smart as a dog trainer to just look at something for face value. We always have to really figure out why the dog is doing something, and putting a label on it or generalizing it too much doesn't really give it, it isn't really doing our job as a balanced dog trainer.
Yeah.
So we have, make sense?
Yeah. And I think a lot of the reason why that is because it's good to put a label on it because that helps us quantify it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But what it needs is perspective. I think that's a lot of times what the client
and
needs.
Context. Yeah. Context
exactly.
is king. Context
right.
is king.
And the thing about, like, if we were talking, like earlier in our training careers, if we're like, oh, but the dog's being, he's adolescent, so he's pushy, he's domineering, he's whatever the case, you may not even be wrong necessarily. Could be. But even if you're not, the story still doesn't end there. There's still a reason for these things. I mean, technically, the dog pulling me today was being defiant, just pulling on a leash while we were healing.
Right.
But there was reason.
But who are you to say that the dog knows what you wanted? Right. That's the argument, right?
Right. Well, my point is dive deep enough. Don't just look at a behavior as face value. Okay, so if the dog is reactive, you're not wrong to say the dog is reactive. If the dog's bitten somebody, you're not really wrong to say the dog's aggressive. But there's more than that. So don't stop there. Yeah. Why is the dog aggressing? Why is the dog reacting? That's where true understanding lies. That's where real transformation can occur.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it just takes sitting back and thinking about it, more stepping away from the problem, So, all right. So just kind of recap some good practices that we see is a constant journey to creating optimal balance for the dog, right? And for that experience, for the whole big picture of everything, making sure that we read our dogs better. And this includes their body language, their behavior. Also, some good practices are make sure that you can be proficient or master as many methods as you possibly can before if you want to consider yourself to be a balanced dog trainer. When we're dealing with bad practices, not balanced enough. So that just pretty much means you haven't mastered specific dog training methods. It's okay if you only know 2 approaches, but at least be good at them, at least master them, at least push them to their limits. Find and seek out a mentor who can teach you and help you with those things. That's super important. Any comments you have on that?
No, if you're having a hard time finding a mentor, I'd say reach out to people around you. I think a lot of dog trainers are only too happy to teach people because they, as dog trainers, of course, share the tenacity for every other dog trainer. We want to make dogs get better. And if that means helping you, then that's what they'll do. And,
exactly.
We're trying our best with this whole thing too. So, kind of stick with us and we're going to do our best to that exact same end there.
Right. And that's the big thing. It's like dog training, guys, is a practice. And, the same way, like my dad's a doctor and every couple months he has to do seminars and workshops to get updated on new information that the medical, field is sharing with each other. And it's like dog training should be the exact same way. And we really need to make sure that we are sharing information with each other, that we're open to hear someone else's opinion, because for the last 30 years, it has been a competitive, I don't want someone to steal my ideas. I don't want people to steal my secrets or my methods. But the reality of it is, guys, it's like, there's no real, there isn't real original ideas in dog training. However, there are very, very special applications. Right. There's very original ways of teaching and connecting with clients. And that happens on the individual level. Right. So the more knowledge that we have, each individual talent that every dog trainer has will be able to be brought to the forefront. But the knowledge needs to be there. Right. Yeah. We need to be able to share that knowledge.
Yeah.
Cool. And so some of the wrong things is they're not balanced enough. They're not well versed in training methods. And they just need which means they need a deeper understanding of those methods. And then sometimes we can't take behaviors for face value. We're going to really need to dive into those and figure out what the deeper causes of those issues are. Right. And that's pretty much, I think we covered a good amount of what balanced dog training is. So I guess let's go ahead and I want to thank you guys so much for being with us on episode 12. This is a deeper look of balanced dog training. Make sure that you add on Instagram, me and Mariano. Go ahead and add Mariano at Untamed Dog Co. That's Untamed CO. And go ahead and add me, Canis Behavior, at Canis Behavior. Go ahead and check back with us because we are going to be doing a couple more of these types of episodes. A deeper look is our segment where we're going to dive into a couple dog training methods. Please also go ahead and subscribe. Go ahead and like this podcast. Follow us on this podcast. Leave a review if you guys can on any one of these medias, whether you're watching on YouTube or whether you're watching on Facebook, whether you're watching anywhere, just go ahead and leave a podcast. Go ahead and email us as well. dogtrainerspodcast@gmail.com. I want to thank you guys so much for listening. Again, my name is Brent, and that guy over there is Mariano, and we'll see you guys soon. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
We'll see you next time.